primary elections came in New York's 13th congressional district, where a 32-year-old Democratic socialist, Daria Lisa Avila Chevalier, managed to beat incumbent Congressman Adriano Espaillat. But Chevalier, who is backed by New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani, has been facing scrutiny now over previously articulated stances and numerous social media posts that she's since deleted. Plus her appearance at a rally the day after Hamas's attack on Israel on October the 7th, 2023, where attendees reportedly suggested the attack was justified. In now deleted social media posts between 2018 and 2022, Chevalier also used expletives to refer to former Vice President Kamala Harris and the Democratic National Committee and expressed support for abolishing police, prisons and borders, as well as seizing private property and calling into question Israel's right to exist. Other reports noted she called former President Joe Biden a rapist and disparaged white people in some of her posts. Chevalier has said she regrets the posts and says she has, quote, grown considerably since writing them. I'm thinking a little bit of Graham Plattner. There are posts for everything, but are Democrats running into a world where they are nominating candidates who are exciting the base but have a history that may come back to haunt them?
It's possible, but we also live in an age of Donald Trump being president, and he has said more things than I can count that would have disqualified candidates of the past. Perhaps we're moving into a new era. Certainly the New York Post gives its thoughts about these candidates. The Wall Street Journal, another Rupert Murdoch-owned organization, their editorial board has a new piece headlined, "The Socialist Democrats of America." And it reads in part this way. It's tempting to dismiss Tuesday's primary sweep by the Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA, as an artifact of weird New York City. It is that, but also more. The victories by Mayor Zohran Mamdani's slate of leftists will change the Democratic Party and perhaps the politics of the country. It's hard to overstate how far to the left the Mamdani slate is. Aber Kawas, who won the primary for a state Senate seat, has said she found it reprehensible to apologize for 9/11 when America hasn't apologized for its system of capitalism and racism and white supremacy. We guess she won't be going to the 25th anniversary ceremony at Ground Zero. Daria Lisa Avila Chevalier, who ousted Rep. Adriano Espaillat, was a leader of the anti-Israel protests at Columbia University after the 2023 Hamas massacre. She was for Hamas. She has called for abolishing police, prisons, and borders. She called Joe Biden a rapist, a war criminal, and says the U.S. has occupied Native American land and called the country an effing disgrace. She favors seizing private property. The DSA is a growing force and has already captured the mayor's office in Washington, D.C., New York, and maybe soon Los Angeles. Bernie Sanders is closer to achieving his dream of capturing the Democratic Party for the left through a younger generation. Republicans may gloat about this far-left Democratic turn, but that is a mistake. Perhaps it will help them keep some House seats this year, but it bodes ill for democracy when the party of the center-left swings even harder left, and many Trump Republicans are also dabbling with socialist ideas. So, Joe, we talked about this for a little bit yesterday, too. I mean, certainly the Post and Journal have their opinions. But, this is candidates for certain communities, certain districts, certain states do not necessarily represent the national party. And we should, again, reflect on the idea of how far to the right Republicans have swung in the age of Trump. This isn't just the phenomenon for one party here.
No, it's certainly not a phenomenon for one party. And of course, Republicans attacking Democrats for shocking social media posts from 4 or 5 years ago, of course, would be exactly what they would do. Democrats would do the same thing. But still, it's not just the Wall Street Journal that is expressing concerns. Sam Stein, I want to read you. This is Michelle Goldberg from yesterday. In her column, she said, last week in an interview with the New York Times editorial board, a group of veteran journalists who questioned local and civic leaders asked the candidate whether she opposed all deportation. She said she opposed all deportations, even those of violent criminals. She's a prison abolitionist. She couldn't or wouldn't answer repeated questions about whether even murderers should be incarcerated. Sam Stein, call me crazy. This doesn't look like the way forward for Democrats, not only in Middle America, but in New York City.
Yeah, I mean, murderers should be incarcerated. I don't think that that's controversial.
You shouldn't. See, he'll just say it. Look at Sam.
Good job,
Wait,
Sam.
that's courage.
Are you okay?
Courage, as Dan Rather would say. You go, man. You go.
Wow.
Thank you. Maybe I should just leave the set on that high note. Also, I would say don't cheer Hamas the day or week after what happened on October 7th. It's deeply problematic and reprehensible to a lot of people in this country who are Jewish and who are legitimately fearful about what's happening. So obviously, there are positions being taken here that are troubling. And if you look in a larger sense, they're going to be used to paint every single Democrat in the House. That would be disingenuous, of course, but it's true. It will happen. I will say this, a couple things. One is on the issue of social media posts. She should be held to account for them, but we also should recognize that in this modern day and age, it's not just that everyone has social media posts that they're embarrassed by, but young people a lot have social media posts that they're going to be embarrassed by. It doesn't negate your responsibility for them, but I do think we need to contextualize this. And then secondarily, I do think the Journal's op-ed on their editorial on this is largely correct. I will say this, though. It leaves out some context that I think is important, which is that this is somewhat, and if not totally confined to major cities, right? It's D.C., where we are at currently, and New York City, which had these elections on Tuesday night. But there are plenty of examples where the Democratic Party in this election cycle has not veered heavily left like the editorial implies, including in New York City. Richie Torres won his primary, for instance. You go across the Hudson, Mickey Sherrill's the governor. That's not DSA Democrats, right? Even on Tuesday night in other states, in Utah, for instance, there was not a DSA Democratic uprising in Salt Lake City. That would be kind of remarkable. But the Democrats have been somewhat pragmatic in places outside of New York. Doesn't mean that Zohran Mamdani doesn't have a power center. Doesn't mean that it is interesting and noteworthy and potentially problematic that the party's veering to the left. But I think holistically, you can't jump to conclusions right away.
Yeah, and in fact, to that point, Sam, in just a few minutes, we're going to be joined by Democratic candidate, a veteran who was their nominee to challenge Mike Lawler in his upstate New York district here. So certainly one size does not fit all. Let's bring into the conversation opinion writer at the New York Times, Mara Gay. Mara, your thoughts? I mean, certainly some of these stances that she has expressed in the past are abhorrent or nonsensical.
Right.
But speak to us about what you're seeing here, this energy from the left, and that includes in New York City, where Zohran Mamdani is playing a bit of a kingmaker.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, those statements are indefensible, and she knows it, which is why she's apologized. Yes, she was younger, but at the same time, and you hope to see more, frankly, from congressional candidates, from people serving in Congress. But I also just want to say that, as you pointed out, in this environment of Trump and Trumpism, people say a lot of offensive things, and you also have to look at what they do. I think I want to pull back here. I want to push back against this idea that New York City's electorate is somehow exceptional from the rest of the country. Certainly, every district is not going to be representative of the entire country. You could say the same thing about a district in Iowa, okay? But the voters did make a decision. And Chevalier won college-educated voters. She won young voters. She won black voters. She lost Hispanic voters and lower-income voters, but won 40% of them. And so there is something to be said for letting the voters have their say. At the same time, you know, these are not voters who are interested in prison abolition. I think the larger context here is that many Americans, not just Democrats, see that the Democratic establishment has failed to win elections in a way that makes their life better and to prevent Donald Trump from gaining power. And they feel that establishment Democrats have failed to serve them in their everyday lives. And so they're taking a chance on something new, on a different option. And I think the DSA, while I'm certainly not a socialist, at the same time, they are introducing competition into Democratic primary elections where there was very little competition. And that's what voters are interested in. That's what they're responding to. Right now, in the Democratic Party, the competition is coming from the left. That's especially true in New York, also in Michigan with Abdul Sayed. There are other places in the country where competition may not come from the left. But more competition is good for democracy, and I think we should let the voters have their say.
All right, so Steve joins us at the table now, and you have a chart looking at how the three primary winners, backed by Mayor Mamdani, underperformed among voters who are less educated and less wealthy, to sort of the point that Mara was just making. Take us through it.
Yeah, so this is interesting and maybe counterintuitive in terms of how the voters chose between the insurgent candidate and the establishment candidate. What you find when you look at this chart, which is up on the screen right now, and I'm going to try to explain it from here, is the vertical axis is the percent of people who had bachelor's degrees or higher. And this, by the way, incorporates 1,100 different precincts across New York in terms of the data. So all three of those congressional districts that we're talking about. Across the bottom, you have median income. So all the way from no income to the right, $250,000 of income. And the blue is are the places where the insurgent won by large margins, and then in the light blue, they won by smaller margins, and the same with the red. So what's interesting here is that the insurgents did least well among the people who you would expect to be the most supportive of them, i.e. people with less education and less income. And the biggest support for the insurgents came from people with more education and higher incomes. And the only other thing I'd point out in the upper right corner, if you can see a little tiny bit of light blue, those are the highest income, highest educated precincts, like Fifth Avenue, for example. They still supported the insurgent, but by a much smaller margin. So at the two extremes, you have less support for the insurgents, and so much of it is coming from basically people who are well educated and make a good bit of money. And the people who you would expect to get the most benefit from it are, in fact, least likely to support the insurgents. And this, of course, mirrors a little bit Donald Trump and the famous white working class voters who supported him, at least then, even though there was not a single thing in Trump's policies or practices that actually helped them.
All right, Morning Joe economic analyst Steve Ratner, thank you very much. And coming up, as Jonathan mentioned, the Democratic nominee for the race for New York's... Welcome back to Morning Joe. It is 13 past the hour. In Tuesday's primary election in New York's 17th congressional district, national security expert and combat veteran Kate Conley won the Democratic nomination for a key swing seat that could help determine control of the House in November. Her victory sets up a showdown with Hudson Valley Republican Congressman Mike Lawler, who has seemed to try balancing more moderate policy positions while also defending President Trump. And U.S. congressional Democratic nominee Kate Conley joins us now. She served as director for counterterrorism on the National Security Council under former President Biden and served 6 tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Let's start there. Talk about your tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan. When did you serve there, and
they shaped you?
And what did you do there, and how did they shape you, especially your work in the special ops?
Well, thank you so much for having me and talking about this important fight, not just for New York 17 and the Hudson Valley, but truly the country. And so my journey in service started right after high school, following the terror attacks on 9/11. It was service and those values that the Hudson Valley inspired in me that led me to go off to West Point and then serve for 16 years on active duty, the privilege of a lifetime leading America's sons and daughters in defense of this nation. And yes, becoming one of the first women to lead in the special ops community, doing multiple tours overseas. It was always about the same thing. Love for this country, love for our community, and a willingness to fight to make sure our nation's best days are still ahead of us. And that is what this fight is about today. I talk a lot about how I'm watching the country that I was willing to die for, that I've lost countless friends fighting for, becoming something I barely recognize. And that's unacceptable.
You know, when I was serving back in the 90s, it was the sort of the end of an era where World War II vets and Korean vets were there. But they had such a remarkable impact, especially when I served on the Armed Services Committee. They had this extraordinary understanding of what tours of duties, repeated tours of duty, lack of resources would do for readiness, would do not only to those serving in uniform, but for the families left behind. Talk about how important you believe it is that we have representatives that have served in combat, that has served in uniform. I can tell you, as someone who didn't, every day I benefited by having veterans and war heroes around me in Congress that helped show me the way on tough issues. Talk about why you think it makes a difference.
I think that's incredible responsibility when you wear the uniform and lead. To never accept excuses, to understand that the stakes don't get any higher than life and death and the safety and security of the American people. And so with that, no matter how hard something is, you have to find a way to succeed. And that kind of mentality of a refusal to accept failure, a refusal to accept excuses, to tackle hard things and find a way to deliver, like that type of ethos is something our government needs to embrace more of. You know, when I talk to folks all across my district, they're so frustrated over the government dysfunction. And I think about my time in the military and how that was never something that could be tolerated. And so, yeah, we're bringing that passion, that fire to fight for this country just in a very different way to what we're doing now, running for New York 17.
Yeah, it looks like the Republicans perhaps didn't want you to win this nomination, spending a bit of money, $1.5 million at least, so that you don't have to face Lawler. Lay out for us what you plan to run on, what you ran on, and why perhaps you are the challenge Mike Lawler doesn't want.
Mika, he was definitely scared to face me in November. And so they tried to do everything they could to stop me because they know I will beat Mike Lawler and stop the chaos, corruption, and terror that this administration is bringing to America. You know, we were just talking about the conflict that's going on and the responsibility of understanding that the lives of service members matter so much and how the use of force should be something that is only done in the most responsible ways. What we're seeing coming out of this administration is one of the most incompetent cabinets in our nation's history. People who should have never been confirmed in the first place, like Pete Hegseth, like Tulsi Gabbard, but they were, because Congress has failed to do its job. And so the fight to take back New York 17, the case that I make to voters is that they deserve better. You know, New York 17 is a district where there's not enough registered Democrats or Republicans to win with just the base alone. 28% of registered voters are unaffiliated or independent. That means as a candidate, you need to appeal to voters, not just as a party, but as a person. And as a Democrat, that means that for me to beat Mike Lawler, I need to not only motivate the Democratic base and Democrats, but earn the votes of people who I may not share a party with, but I share values with. That's what we did for this primary. And that's what we're going to do in November to take back New York 17 and give people a leader they deserve.
So congratulations on the nomination. So it sounds like you feel like part of this race will be nationalized, right? The unhappiness of those about President Trump and the leadership of him and his team. But what are some of the local issues that you're encountering there? What are, when you speak to voters each and every day, I assume affordability, what else?
To your point, the impact of this administration and the failure of people like Mike Lawler and this Congress to rein it in is being felt every day. Whether it's people on the streets of our community who are living in fear, to include people, by the way, who are American citizens, who may come from, Hispanic origins, who fear that they may get rolled up by ICE just because of the color of their skin. Like, that's the reality in America. And I want to be very clear. I put the uniform on and fought for this nation to defend freedoms, not to watch our own government tear it away from people right here at home. And so, yes, fear is a concern. Affordability is a concern. We are watching as energy providers across this district are seeking double-digit rate increases at a time where you're already watching as people are making trade-offs between groceries and prescriptions. And now the war in Iran has jacked up gas prices. And so now they're balancing, do I fill up the gas tank or the grocery cart? This administration, what it's done, it has been very clear it does not care about working class families. It does not care about the problems they are facing. And instead of fighting for those people, instead of fighting for families, Mike Lawler has given Donald Trump a blank check where you have families unable to even balance their checkbook.
You know, I have family that lives in that district, and that area, the Hudson Valley and the region, has a long tradition of being interested in politicians of both parties and even Republicans who they may see as more moderate. So what is your argument specifically against Mike Lawler instead of Donald Trump?
Mike Lawler is a very skilled communicator because he spent the last 20 years as a political operative and political hack, where I've spent the last 20 years leading America's sons and daughters in defense of this nation. Mike Lawler wants to get credit for doing things. You know, he's the guy who starts the fire and then wants credit for calling the fire department when really he is an arsonist. I think this goes back to showing people exactly who he is. He'll say one thing and do something completely different. And that record, he's not going to be able to outrun because people are feeling it every day in their homes. His decision to vote for H.R. 1, the one big ugly bill last year, resulted in 37,000 people in my district losing health care coverage, resulted in tens of millions of dollars for SNAP benefits being removed at a time where people are struggling to feed their families. Mike Lawler votes one way, Donald Trump's way. And people are seeing it regardless of how they register to vote.
I think, Kate, that's what I will say at the time surprised some of us around this table. We know Mike. I know Mike. We've interviewed Mike countless times on this show, and he always would come on and, for the most part, be an independent voice. You go, well, okay, well, he sounds reasonable. He's willing to stand up and speak out against Donald Trump. But when the votes came, when the big votes came, you know, we had him on asking him whether he would vote for the, as you say, the big ugly bill. He would say the big beautiful bill. And I gave him specifics of the hospitals that would have funding slashed. I gave him specifics, like you just said, of the number of people in his district that would lose health care. And I will say, even I voted for several of the Contract with America items, but I refused to cut Medicaid. I said Medicare, I meant Medicaid, because I said, listen, we may have to balance a budget, but we're not going to do it on the backs of poor people. That's exactly what this bill did. So we have him coming on talking like a moderate, but then he votes with Donald Trump on that. Then he goes to town hall meetings and he actually supported the deployment of ICE in Los Angeles that even a right-wing Supreme Court said was unconstitutional. And this is not my case against Mike. I'm just trying to figure out who he is and why we talk to him. We're like, sounds pretty moderate. But then he votes, it seems, with Donald Trump and supports, again, even unconstitutional troop deployments across America.
Joe, the only principle he has is loyalty to Trump and his own political career. And that has been made very, very clear with his actions. And that's what this is about. Since Mike Lawler has been elected in November of 2022, it has only been harder for families to put food on the table, a roof over their heads, keep the lights on, or afford health care. And that is failure. That is unacceptable. And that's why we're giving the voters of New York 17 a choice for change.
Well, let me ask you one final question. I don't know, you may not have had time to read some of the editorials about some of these candidates who got elected in New York City, but one in particular, I mean, there's just been some really radical statements. People refusing to condemn 9/11, people calling Joe Biden a racist or a rapist, candidates attacking Kamala Harris, people saying, not even telling the New York Times whether they believed murderers should be sent to prison, wanting to defund the police. Could you respond for what you do know of these candidates? Can you respond to what you think of all of those statements, especially the one about 9/11?
Yeah. I mean, I joined the Army and went to West Point because of 9/11, because I watched the suffering and pain that we as a nation, we as a state, we as the Hudson Valley experienced that day. And so when you talk about the American government's responsibility to the people, it is to keep it safe. That is where border security is part of national security. And you can support border security and immigration and understand that immigration has been and will continue to be essential to our nation's success. You can support responsible community policing to keep our families safe. You know, as a former military police officer in the Army, you are there as a police officer, as a first responder, on the worst days of people's lives when they need help. And so going back to when you talk to what folks want for their families, it's safety, it's security, it's opportunity. And that's the government's job to provide. And so while, you know, folks were elected down in New York City, in New York 17, Democratic voters chose a West Point grad and 16-year Army combat veteran to be their representative in this fight this fall.
Democratic nominee for U.S. Congress in New York, Kate Conley, thank you very, very much for coming on the show this morning. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, take care. And still ahead on Morning Joe, with artificial intelligence reshaping nearly every aspect of our lives, our next guest. 32 past the hour, our next guest argues America cannot withstand an impending economic shock, warning that AI-driven mass unemployment is a potential crisis on the horizon. In an effort to combat that, former U.S. Commerce Secretary and former Governor of Rhode Island, Gina Raimondo, is launching a new organization titled Raise Us, focused on preparing the American workforce to make a successful transition to an AI economy. And former Secretary Raimondo joins us now. She is the CEO of Raise Us. It's good to have you back on the show.
Secretary, great to have you here. AI obviously continues to be a growing issue politically. It even had an impact in some of New York's races earlier this week. You have used the word intentional. We need to be more intentional about this. It seems that we are seeing unleashed before us one of the most powerful forces in the history of humankind, and yet you have the White House taking money from AI sector. You've got contributions flowing heavily to Congress. AI businesses are telling us, don't worry, everything's okay, nothing to worry about, buddy. It doesn't seem like anybody is stepping back, being responsible, and looking at how this is going to displace millions and millions of workers. Talk about that, and then what your plan is.
Yeah, thank you, Joe, and good morning. So, look, I think ultimately AI will probably create more jobs, new jobs, like every technology has. What I'm worried about is the transition from here to there. And we need a plan to be deliberate, like you said, to make sure that America leads the global AI competition. That is very important. I don't think we should back away. We should lead the global AI competition, but in a way that brings every worker along. It cannot be that we just race toward, we just make all these investments in the technology without a similarly bold plan to bring Americans along. So that's the whole point of this new organization I've created, Raise Us. We have dozens of companies, including AI companies. We've raised about $500 million, and we propose to work through governors to start innovating. We have to find a path to do both. Lead in the technology and bring everyone along in America. Because, by the way, high unemployment, political unrest, social unrest is not good for anyone. Not these businesses, not any American.
Governor, it looks like the guardrails aren't going to come from regulation because of the relationship, in part, between the big tech companies and the AI producers and this administration, but just because it's very difficult to regulate this field. But it could be that guardrails come from public opinion. I saw a poll recently suggesting that AI is currently less popular than ICE is in the United States. And I think it is behind some of what we saw with the success of more radical left-wing candidates in New York. You're hearing it from young people all the time, this antipathy not just towards data centers, but the fear about what's going to happen to their jobs. Do you think we're on the point of a real political backlash that fuels something that looks more radical from the left in the United States because of AI?
Yeah, there's no question. Anxiety about AI is through the roof. By the way, people have some reason to be anxious. No one has said to them, we're going to implement AI, and we're also going to make sure that there's a job for you and your family and your children in an AI economy. So without explaining to people, this is a plan for the technology, and oh, by the way, here's how we're going to protect you, it's reasonable that people would be anxious. And I worry about that backlash. I spent my life as Commerce Secretary making sure the United States stays ahead of China, making sure the United States leads in innovation. So we have to do that with AI. But we can't just say to people, full steam ahead, making the best chips, making the best models, and we'll figure out whether you have a job later. And so what I'm telling every CEO, and I'm proud of the CEOs who have stepped up here. We have, some serious companies, Amazon, Microsoft, Bank of America. They have stepped, a lot of CEOs. We have governors on a bipartisan basis. As a former governor, I think the way to get things done is through governors. And we want to, get to work putting in place real policies and plans that bring Americans along.
So explain how Raise Us, what's the tangible, practical work that you will do to help prepare people for this changing workforce toward AI?
So it's a combination. We want to work with governors to, quite frankly, try new things, right? Like unemployment insurance was created 100 years ago and really hasn't been changed. I don't think unemployment insurance, the way it exists, is going to get us through AI. For example, right now, if you're on unemployment insurance and you start your own business, chances are you get kicked off. So we're going to work with governors in this one example to say, you can keep your unemployment insurance, and we, Raise Us, will fund a startup accelerator, helping people, teaching people to start your own business using AI, but allowing them to continue to get support payments the whole time. We're going to work with Governor Moore on a year of service. A lot of young people are anxious. Is there a job for me? Can I get an entry-level job? So we're going to have a year of service to help young people learn the skills they need, practical work skills. So it's a number of specific practical initiatives, working with companies. Companies cannot just hit the easy button, which is the layoff button. We provide lots of tax incentives and the like for them to invest in capital. How about we incentivize them to retrain and redeploy workers? So, Mika, I don't have the exact answer. Quite frankly, I don't think anybody does. But what I know is the fear-mongering is not helpful. Pretending that this isn't coming and could be a big deal is clearly not helpful. It's why people are anxious. So everybody get in the boat and let's innovate and find solutions.
CEO of Raise Us, former U.S. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo, thank you very much for coming on the show this morning. We really appreciate it.
Nice to see you.
All right, good to see you.
ভিতর গভীরে তোমাকে সাজিয়ে নৌকো ভাসিয়ে যাব বহুদূর রাতে ওই জোছনা